You came, though, to listen to our exciting panelists here today. And before I introduce them, I want to provide a little bit of foundation and background on Justice 40. So we know, based on the statements that have been made, that environmental justice and equity form the cornerstone of the new administration. And equity is the Department of Energy's North Star. But what do we really mean by equity and environmental justice? The legacy of pollution runs long and deep in communities of color in the United States. In America, black households are more likely than other communities to live in the shadows of fossil fuel generation. Black and Latinx people in our country are also exposed to more pollution than they create. And these same communities face a raft of cumulative burdens, including heightened exposure to climate hazards. This is environmental injustice. And the clean energy transformation that we are all working towards will help to make these communities clean and safe for all. And as Gina McCarthy mentioned, the President's commitments to justice and equity extend to our nation's environmental justice communities, as well as communities in transition away from economic reliance on fossil fuels. The equitable decarbonization of our economy requires a transformative commitment to target these disadvantaged communities for clean energy investments, new jobs, and new businesses. The Biden administration is committed to that transformation. And so in this administration, we realize that climate action cannot be divorced from addressing the deep legacies of injustice in our country. We recognize that the racial and economic disparities that we see throughout the United States result from the legacies of government-sanctioned policies and systems. And so just as these policies were created intentionally, our efforts to undo their harm must also be intentional. And so Justice 40 provides a pathway for equitable deep decarbonization that transforms and builds wealth in underserved and overburdened communities. The Justice 40 initiative was established by Executive Order 14008, mentioned in both of the opening remarks, and that is the executive order on tackling the climate crisis at home and abroad. The Justice 40 initiative mandates that 40% of the overall benefits of certain federal investments have to go to disadvantaged communities. And so that means 40% of the benefits of investments in clean energy and energy efficiency, clean transit and affordable housing, training and workforce development, the remediation and reduction of legacy pollution, and the development of clean water infrastructure. 40% of the benefits of those investments have to go to disadvantaged communities. And so President Biden is committed to securing environmental justice and spurring economic opportunity for disadvantaged communities that have been historically marginalized and overburdened by pollution and underinvestment in housing, transportation, water, and wastewater infrastructure, and healthcare. The Justice 40 initiative is a critical part of the administration's whole of government approach to tackling the climate crisis. The agencies gathered today, and our advocates as well, are deeply committed to the successful implementation of the Justice 40 initiative, which tackles head-on the issues of environmental injustice. Okay, so with that, now that we're all on the same page, I am so delighted to introduce our panelists for today. And I want to start with our panelists from across the federal family, beginning with Dr. Candace Valsing, who is the Associate Director for Climate, Energy, Environment, and Science at the Office of Management and Budget at the White House. She received her PhD in Environmental Health Science at UC Berkeley, and she is the lead for the Justice 40 initiative at the Office of Management and Budget. So welcome, Candace, to the stage. I also want to introduce two panelists who are joining us virtually from Washington, D.C. and California, so deep commitment to them. It's very early in the morning over there. First, I want to introduce Christopher Coase, who is currently the Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary for Transportation Policy in the Office of the Assistant Secretary for Transportation Policy at the U.S. Department of Transportation. Coase recently served as the Vice President for Land Use and Development at Smart Growth America. He was a senior fellow at the Brookings Institute. He's a professor as well at George Washington University, and he also has served as a deputy director and Senior Advisor for the Transportation for America campaign. So welcome, Christopher. And again, I owe you that beer when I get back to DC. Thanks for joining so early. Okay, and also I want to recognize and introduce Dr. Phil Fine, who I'm hoping is not joining from California, which would be really early for you. Okay, great. And he is currently the Principal Deputy Associate Administrator for Policy at the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency, EPA. Fine joins EPA after 15 years at the South Coast Air Quality Management District in Southern California, and he most recently served as a Deputy Executive Officer for the Planning, Rural Development, and Area Sources Division, where he oversaw all divisions, or all activities of the division, including help develop the state implementation plans and air quality management plans in California. So Dr. Fine is the author of over 50 peer-reviewed scientific publications. He received his PhD from the California Institute of Technology in Environmental Sciences and Engineering, and has his bachelor's degree from UC Berkeley. So welcome, Dr. Fine, to the stage. I also want to introduce our two of our other in-person guests. I'm incredibly honored to introduce panelists who currently serve on our country's first ever White House Environmental Justice Advisory Council. Dr. Beverly Wright, who is really no stranger to the environmental justice movement. She's a member of the WEJAC, as we call it, and she provides advice and policy recommendations to the chair of the Council on Environmental Quality, as well as our internal committee that works on environmental justice across government. She is an environmental justice scholar, an advocate, author, civic leader, professor of sociology, and the founder and executive director of the Deep South Center for Environmental Justice. She has deep roots in the Gulf South, hailing from New Orleans. She received her BA from Grambling College, a historically black college in Louisiana. She has an MA and PhD from State University of New York at Buffalo. Welcome, Dr. Wright. And finally, last but not least, I am delighted to introduce Jade Begay, who's also a member of the WEJAC. Jade is the Climate Justice Campaign Director at Indian Collective and leads the collective's climate justice campaign work and brings extensive experience working in climate justice movement spaces throughout Turtle Island and within indigenous communities across the globe. She is also a woman of many talents, has worked as a multimedia producer, filmmaker, communications professional, working in nonprofit and indigenous organizations. She has a bachelor's degree in film and video and a master's of arts degree in environmental leadership. We have an all-star, rock star group of folks, and I am excited to kick this off. So welcome everyone. Let's go ahead and just give our panelists a quick round of applause. Okay. So I'm actually going to join our panelists seated and make this a little bit more interactive. Dr. Volsing, you're currently in the Office of Management and Budget, and as we've said a couple times today, Justice 40 is meant to be tackled through a whole of government approach. So how are OMB and the White House team making a whole of government approach to Justice 40? How are you guys doing that, and how important do you think a collaborative interagency approach to Justice 40 will be to its success?
Sure. Thank you, Shalanda, and thank you everyone for putting this on this event today on this very important topic. So one to start with, I don't know if many of our colleagues here are familiar with this, but environmental justice and the whole of government approach that we're taking to environmental justice and to climate change is something that the president committed to while on the campaign. He was the first presidential candidate to have an environmental justice plan that he ran on, and we took that and embedded it into the whole of government approach we're taking to both climate change and other issues as well. So as our speakers have said, and as we know, climate change has disproportionate impacts, whether it's energy burden or the various disasters we've seen over the years on environmental justice in disadvantaged communities. The president thinks this is not acceptable, and so that's why we're taking this whole government approach, which really pulls together every element of government to tackling climate crisis and furthering environmental justice. So what we did at OMB and the White House is really three things. One, we put together a plan. It's government, we love plans. Two, we took a bottom-up approach. And three, we are building off of best practices and lessons learned and really sharing across government. So I'll just speak really quickly about those three things. So as I said, the plan began before the president took office with this platform, which was helped put together with many of the people you see here today, with a lot of input. After that, when we got into office the first week, as Shalanda mentioned, the president put out a whole of government executive order on how to tackle climate change, and that laid out a playbook and an instruction, essentially, for how we from the White House can really work across government to take this whole of government approach. So we from OMB, which pretty wonky place in the White House, what we do mainly is we help implement the president's agenda, and we of course manage the budget and budget execution. So that's incredibly important in terms of meeting our Justice 40 goal, which, as Shalanda mentioned, is directing 40% of the benefits to disadvantaged communities. So what we did next is we issued guidance. It took us a little bit to put this together, and we know this is a work in progress. So this summer we issued interim guidance, which affects all agencies across the entire federal government. So that's anywhere from the Department of Health to the Department of Transportation to the Environmental Protection Agency, which you'll see here today. And we took that guidance, and it's just a first step, and it was informed by the WEJAC, so the Advisory Council that we've been mentioning about, and we have 2 members from here today. And all of that we are continuously iterating on, but that's the many elements of the plan that we're executing from the White House and the Office of Management and Budget. The bottom-up approach we're taking through the interim guidance in that plan builds off agencies' capacities and their best practices and what they know. So in order to make this last and stick, it's really important that we build on where agencies are, and we really take this bottom-up approach so that it is ingrained in the fundamental actions that they're doing. So that's the second thing, is this bottom-up approach that we're taking that builds off of the mission and the individual expertise of each agency. And the third thing is sharing best practices and lessons learned. So this is a new thing for us in the federal government. It's incredibly exciting, it's incredibly inspiring. And so we've set up a number of different mechanisms to be able to have the various different, whether it's 20 different agencies all on the phone together, talking to each other about what's working and not working as we set up this guidance and as we implement it across the government. And it's a really beautiful thing to be on a call with hundreds of people across the federal government, because in the day of Zoom you actually get to see all these people and have them be asking questions about how to really get this right. And so that's the whole government approach that we're taking.
Wow, so again, very ambitious, groundbreaking work. I've been on a few of those multi-hundred people calls, and I can say that I've learned a lot from my colleagues here. And I want to kick it over to Christopher Coase and Dr. Philip Fine. So starting with you, Christopher, our DOE team has developed a sort of set of policy approaches to Justice 40 based on deep dives into the literature and based on conversations with frontline communities, folks from environmental justice communities. We're really looking at, reducing energy burden, which is one of the things that is a key focus for us here at DOE, reducing environmental impacts of energy development, ensuring equitable deployment of clean energy technologies, because we know that the deployment rate of clean energy technologies has not been equitable thus far. We also want to increase pathways for accessing capital in disadvantaged communities and increasing resilience and energy democracy in communities around the country. And so those are the focal points for Department of Energy. But Christopher, I know that you are also looking at equity from a few different angles, and I was wondering if you could talk about the Department of Transportation's approach to Justice 40, really thinking through how Justice 40 connects with other equity priorities. And again, appreciate you being here this morning.
First, good morning, everyone. And again, thank you, Shalana and team, for the invitation to represent our great department and our Secretary Buttigieg. Secretary Buttigieg, back in March, said something that I think really centers the conversation about how DOT is approaching Justice 40. We recognize that transportation can be an enormous engine for opportunity for communities, all communities, but it also has been a major source of inequity, particularly environmental justice challenges, whether it's highways going through communities or increasing transportation cost burden. The fight for racial equity, community equity, mobility has always been inseparable from decisions around transportation. At the department, we know big investments, big projects like what we are seeing across the country as we move to a net zero decarbon economy, we know that comes with some real concerns around equity, particularly like gentrification or displacement. We recognize, and where we're centering our work, particularly around equity and the Justice 40 work, is to make sure that everyone shares in the benefits of these massive investments and change of decarbonization. Justice 40 is, in our view, potentially one of the most transformative programs that can shift us from avoiding the harm to be actually more proactive in investing in historically disadvantaged and underserved communities. It's really pushing us to think critically about what it means to be a disadvantaged community and understand the benefits and outcomes of our own transportation programs, not just the important inputs like how much funding, how many miles saved. For DOT, this initiative boils down to two key factors: understanding the drivers of a disadvantaged and overburdened and underserved community, and then appropriately understanding the social and economic benefits of our transportation programs. And I have to be honest, the latter is a significant challenge for us because it's forcing us to think through all the outcomes of transportation investments, but also the benefit and user profiles of those benefits and investments. I believe, and I think my colleagues at the department concur as well, is that one of the most critical actions around infrastructure investments, how they're being made, is really about centering and lifting, empowering communities that have been traditionally left out of the conversation. Secondly, for the department and our ecosystems, working with state and local governments, whether it's also transit agencies and new players in the transportation mobility space, and making sure that we are rebooting the ecosystem that is centered on a national mobility strategy, reducing environmental and transportation cost burden on communities, but also making sure that we're getting different outcomes for frontline communities. For us to succeed, we hope to utilize a more integrated ecosystem that allows for a co-creating of investment strategies with communities that are most impacted by chronic disinvestment and environmental disparities. Justice 40, in our view, provides that pathway towards that goal.
Christopher, just want to say how inspiring your work has been to me, as a colleague at the federal family. You all are doing such great work over there at DOT. I want to turn it over to you, Dr. Fine. Phil, can you talk to us about EPA's biggest priorities for Justice 40, and again, just sort of lay a little bit of foundation for the audience today?
Thank you, Shalonda, and I'm very happy. Thanks for the invitation. Very happy to be here. Wish I could be there in person. So for EPA, first, we want to emphasize that everything we do to implement this program must be rooted in the needs, desires, demands of the communities most disproportionately burdened across the United States. The administration and my boss, EPA Administrator Michael Regan, have very, very clearly directed that our thinking and our decisions must always be grounded in the realities of the communities that need our help the most. So these investments really need to be community-driven and, to the extent we can, community-led. Another huge priority for us is making sure that our work and goals are always coordinated, and you've heard this from others, with the efforts, abilities of our partners, especially federal agencies and departments. So while EPA has 6 of the 21 pilot programs, that's the most of any agency. Shalonda, you're close behind at 5 programs. Our programs range from getting the lead out of drinking water, to reclaiming contaminated lands, to replacing dirty diesel engines. But there's dozens of other programs that'll certainly be added for EPA to the Justice 40 program. But as EPA resources touch down on the ground, we have to be sure to maximize the benefits of our investments by leveraging the work of our other federal partners in those same communities. And the third priority for us at EPA is to make sure that what we do is sustainable and long-lasting. And there's 2 aspects of that. First, we have to ensure that the changes we are now making inside of EPA about how we allocate resources and make decisions are not just one-time actions. We have to change how we think about achieving our mission and how we implement the statutes and resources and programs that are authorized by Congress in a different way. And second, as we change our thinking and redirect our efforts and resources, we have to ensure that those resources add lasting value and benefits to the communities. It's not just putting money on the ground. It's looking at those communities and making sure they're lasting. We have to learn we've learned through a lot of our experience that every decision we make, every action we take, has the potential for unintended consequences in communities. So making sure that the changes we make for the long term both inside of EPA and on the ground, result in long-term improvements for the communities. And that's really key for us. So the Justice 40 initiative, while it's historic, it's really not complicated. It's really about ensuring that government resources focus on communities that need them the most, making sure that they are deployed in a way that advance each community's own vision for the future.
So much, Phil. Just, again, really inspired by your own perspective and EPA's perspective on Justice 40 and its historic nature, but also you mentioned sort of the fundamental simplicity of it, right? Listening to communities, starting from the bottom, and I think I heard that from both you and Christopher. So I want to open the floor to Dr. Beverly Wright, who, for those of you in the audience, you should know that we're all standing on her shoulders and the shoulders of so many people who really created a pathway for Justice 40 to be a thing here in the United States. And so I want to ask you about the White House Environmental Justice Advisory Council. How did you, as a member, help to advise the development of the Justice 40 initiative, which we all know is historic and has the potential to be extraordinarily transformative?
Good morning or good evening. I'm not certain where I am or what time it is, but I'm just glad to be awake and not falling off the chair. I do want to say that every time I come to something like this and people begin talking about me, talking about standing on my shoulders, I feel like a fossil. I feel like I'm getting so old and I'm trying to figure out when did this happen. But I do want to say that I don't believe that I individually advise the administration on WEJAC. I think that as a group, we all advise President Biden, even through his transition team initially, where we began holding meetings with our communities first to decide what it is we wanted President Biden to pay attention to. And in all of the different regions where we have EJ groups or communities, we came together with those recommendations and then presented that to the committee. So I hail from Louisiana, one of the most polluted states in the country. I began this work because people were sick and dying. And then later we made the connection between Cancer Alley and the petrochemical industry and climate change. And we did that long before anybody was saying climate justice. So environmental justice and climate justice are the same to us. They are, in fact, the same people. And so advising the Biden administration on what communities of color, African American, Indigenous, Asian Pacific Islanders, Latinos, people of color are individual groups, and I always like to say that, with certain needs that are different. And so in coming together to advise the Biden administration on what we should do, we basically said we need to be a step up from the NEJAC. And so I was on the inaugural committee for NEJAC. That was first, but it had no power. The way we saw it, we had really good ideas, real good recommendations, but there seemed to be no place to push them forward, and there was no money. NEJAC certainly needed to be a group with a lot more power, and so it actually reports to the president, and along with it, with the Justice 40 initiative, it has a lot more power now because there will be monies assigned to all of the communities that we've been working with for the last 40 years or so, with a lot of promises, really goodwill, but the conditions of our communities remain the same. We hope that this means change, and we will see some differences for our communities.
Just getting my mask off here. Thank you so much, Dr. Wright. You are not a fossil. Everyone can see that you're not a fossil. So you're alive and well, and we're so glad that you're still a part of this movement. I want to turn it to Jade Begay last, but again, not least, to bring your voice into this conversation. So we've talked a lot today about communities of color, low-income communities, as well as Indigenous people and citizens of tribal nations. We know that across the United States, these particular communities have been disproportionately impacted by environmental pollutants and by the impacts of climate change. So how do frontline communities across the United States, including communities represented by the WEJAC cohort, how do they hope that we can achieve, what do they hope that we can achieve through the Justice 40 initiative? What is the hope?
Yeah, really awesome question. Really happy to be here this morning. Thank you everyone for being here with us. So my colleagues here, yourself and Chairman Mallory, both, you all have mentioned addressing the harm that has been caused through this initiative, right? So I want to share some context to understand, how we got here. So for Indigenous communities in particular, the BIA, the Bureau of Indian Affairs, was created in the Department of War, and then it was carried over to the Department of Interior, the DOI, who over many years and decades carried out policies that were intentionally meant to terminate our people. So I mention this again because it's important to understand the history that has led us here to all these environmental injustices, to climate injustices. Really tribes were positioned to be enemies and to be oppressed by this government. So when we talk about Justice 40 or any environmental policy or climate justice policy for that matter, we need to be addressing to undo this past and to be honest about what has happened in the past. So this is what it really means to be intersectional, I believe. And I guess what we're hopeful about Justice 40, and this is coming from the perspective of my organization, NDN Collective, we're hoping that through Justice 40, the federal government really learns how to equitably channel resources directly to our frontline and Indigenous communities, and we can help. There's a prime example over the last year with the CARES funding that kicked in for Indigenous communities during the pandemic. So, there's a bottleneck that can happen in the process where it takes a while for this federal funding to get invested into our communities and then to make its way directly to people. And so while that process is happening, NDN organizations like mine, we've stepped in to really channel urgent and quick resources to our people. So we can really support initiatives like Justice 40 in learning the nuances of how to get funding to tribal governments, also help build capacity. So yeah, I'm really hopeful about this type of partnership and this type of working together to understand, like I said, these nuances about how we really equitably resource our people.
Yeah, so Jade, you took us back, right? Sort of laying a little bit of foundation in terms of history, and so we appreciate that. And we've heard, some really key things that I just want to distill. One, from our agency partners, this has to be a bottom-up effort. I think two, real commitments, real dollars, real power, as Dr. Wright said. And three, I think, as you're saying, Jade, really grounding ourselves in the history and being very clear about sort of the structural things that we still have to overcome. And so I want to turn to the second half of our discussion. Now that we have that foundation set, I want to go back to you, Dr. Fine, with a question for EPA. So many here from the United States are familiar with EPA's longstanding commitments to environmental justice, as well as longstanding commitments to stakeholder engagement. That's something that we know very well. And so I was wondering what we can learn from EPA. In particular, what have been some of your biggest lessons on stakeholder engagement? And what advice do you have for local and state communities and activists to promote equity, energy justice, and meaningful stakeholder engagement in this work? So what can we learn from you, Phil?
Thanks, Yolanda, And thanks. The EPA obviously had a little bit of a head start on environmental justice, but obviously we have not solved all the problems. We have a long way to go. So effective and meaningful engagement is obviously a key principle of all this work. You've heard it from everyone on the panel. It is front and center in everything we're doing in this space. So there are a few important lessons from EPA's history and our current activities engaging communities on environmental justice. So one of the most important lessons is you can never be too transparent. You've got to show what you're doing, show what you're up to, where you are in the process, what your thinking is, even if you're not even done thinking. And I know that's hard to do for government agencies. We try to present a final product and then take feedback, but I think we need to engage every step of the way. And being transparent is also is a fundamental requirement for meaningful engagement, but transparency is also its form of accountability, which is an equally important principle for this work and for justice. So you have to be both transparent and accountable. A couple other things I'd like to mention. Often in the past, engaging communities has sort of been a check the box exercise. So if you're engaging to just check the box, you're not really ready to take in what you hear and change the way you're thinking and really be open to the possibility of changing your decisions. The community is going to sense that right away, and it's not going to be meaningful and help you do your work in the way that we want to do it. You have to go into each engagement really committed to take in what you hear and then be ready with accountability to show on paper in meaningful ways that engagement and those ideas influenced our thinking and the decision that was made. And we should show exactly how those engagements result in a different outcome than they otherwise would have. We also need to be open to incorporating other types of community information and experiences into our decisions. Typically, we're stuck on the data that's available to us. When I was thinking about this, I was going to call this non-traditional information, but it actually is the core traditional information, community experiences, people's experience, and that has to be a major part of our decision making as well. The second thing I want to emphasize is that government is very complex and very opaque. I've only been at it for 9 months, and it's still hard for me to figure out. It is our responsibility as civil servants to provide the capacity to communities to understand the inner workings of government so they can help change those inner workings of government when it's not working for them. So training, technical assistance, making sure all the information is in all languages needed, grants, outreach, whatever it takes to make sure that the community can meaningfully engage with us. And it's not a simple task. It's a lot of resources, a lot of commitment of time, effort, and money. But if we don't raise the community's ability to engage with us, then that imbalance of information will always hinder inclusive engagement. So for Justice 40 in particular, we were fortunate to have already a pretty robust infrastructure in place to engage disadvantaged communities. We had our National Environmental Justice Advisory Council, which Dr. Wright mentioned. We had monthly public calls open to anyone to call in across the country, but we've increased them to twice a month now with Justice 40 and other actions we're taking. And also we've had many, many years of building relationships with people on the ground in disadvantaged communities all across the nation.
So thank you so much for that overview. I'm hearing a lot about transparency in your remarks, about capacity building, and you, as a scientist with over 50 publications, you said that the government is complex, so that sounds quite daunting, but I think for us as civil servants, it means that we have to do the work to translate what's happening inside to the folks who are really on the ground. Christopher, I'm going to turn it back to you. I teed you up with kind of asking about DOT's Justice 40 priorities, and I want to do an even deeper dive into DOT's commitments on equity in the climate space, right? So, I know there's just a lot of excitement around infrastructure right now, particularly at the Department of Transportation. And I was wondering if you could talk about how DOT is incorporating equity into its climate policies writ large, and how those policies actually connect to Justice 40. Again, it's building on the prior question to you.
Thank you, Shalonda. From day one, the Biden-Harris administration named racial equity and tackling climate change as immediate priorities, and the department re-recognized as a level of intersectionality. If you're going to address climate, you have to address equity. If you're going to address equity, you have to address climate. And for us, that also connects with our work around safety, because for our department, when it comes to transportation, safety is our number one priority. But you can't do that if we're not recognizing the climate crisis we're in and doing it in a way that uplifts voices that have been long not heard or disinvested. Through the Justice 40 initiative, we have been really excited to be one of the co-leads of the interagency process, working with you and Phil and others. But one of the things that we are doing right now is we're using the Justice 40 initiative, particularly the key piece that Candace mentioned, which is developing a methodology to accurately identify and quantify the impacts and benefits of our DOT programs. And that is going to be key to be able to look at the transportation cost burdens, the environmental justice challenges, not only at the place level, but also at a user level, for us to be able to better educate not only ourselves, where we're bringing in our economists, our data experts, our programming specialists, among others, as well as working with our key partners like state DOTs, transit agencies, NPOs, and local governments, so that they have a better articulation and awareness of how the built environment exists for underserved and disadvantaged communities, and be able to target resources directly. Next, as you may hear this is yet again another example of the importance of, but we're also holding a number of public meetings to engage and ensure that we're getting it right. Engagement is key, and it's something that for the department is actually new for us. Normally, the stakeholder engagement happens with our local partners, our state partners, but we're recognizing that we need to build a capacity within the department to be able to engage with communities directly, and that is something we're very much committed to. But we're also taking steps to ensure that our discretionary grant process considers climate. And one of the things I will say is that in his first weeks as Secretary Buttigieg released a requirement to ensure that we're embedding racial equity and climate in our discretionary grant programs. And right now, our operating modes, so that's transit, our highway, our Federal Railroad Administration, meaning others, are right now evaluated to the degree where proposed projects are meeting specific criteria, like how are these projects significantly reducing greenhouse gas emissions? How are these aligned with meeting the president's goal of net zero in the next decade? How are these projects supporting physically responsible land use and transportation design? How are we increasing climate resiliency within the infrastructure, and particularly to those who are most vulnerable? But I have to say that in addition to some of those key administrative actions that we've taken, we are really excited. Your question is how are we incorporating climate and equity into our day-to-day work is really emblematic in what we're seeing with the new infrastructure bill. As a team working with the secretary and working with the president, we were able to craft a transportation bill that will have one of the largest investments in public transportation, the largest investment in bike and ped infrastructure, like our Transportation Alternatives Program, which we know will benefit disadvantaged communities who are less likely to own cars. This would be the largest investment in electrical vehicles, which reduce harmful emissions disproportionately impacted by communities. For the first time ever, we are going to have a new program that will be dedicated to reconnecting communities that have been long divided by highway or rail and other infrastructure projects. In addition, we will be having one of the largest investment in port infrastructure to reduce emissions from idling trucks at port facilities that will improve the air quality, as well as create new workforce opportunities. On top of that, we recognize that there's so much more for us to do. And I think where we are really excited is that the equity and the climate work we are now infusing in our day-to-day, particularly as pertains to the EJET. And I think for all of us, this is a wonderful opportunity to really show that government at a whole, working with local, state, and even private sector actors, that we can get things done. But more importantly, we can actually create a built environment that is worth living and playing for all Americans.
Wow. Christopher. Again, just such inspiring work really coming out of the Department of Transportation. We can't overstate the historic nature of what you all are doing there. And again, it's great to see how equity is just woven throughout every single thing you all are doing. So kudos, and I look forward to working with you and being close on that work. I want to turn it back to Dr. Valsing with a question for Office of Management and Budget, which is really, the office that is leading this charge. We can't overstate Justice 40's historic and transformative trajectory for the United States, but we're here at COP, right? We're here at COP, and we know that every single nation has to decarbonize in order to meet the Paris targets and transition our global economy. So in this global transition, we will no doubt confront issues of equity and justice. My own career as an academic began exploring the issues at the intersection of this transition and justice. And so I was wondering if you could share with the audience how we can make the goals of something like Justice 40 attainable to other nations, right? And how can Justice 40 be a model for other governments around the world?
Thank you, Shalanda. So first off, just to build off what Christopher said earlier, I just want to double down on the fact that the President's Buildback Better framework, which was announced last week and Christopher referred to, includes a couple parts. IJA, he called it, that's the infrastructure package that we released earlier this summer, and then the Buildback Better framework from this week, or last week, excuse me. So those together will make the largest investment in environmental justice in history. And so just wanted to double down and reinforce that in addition to DOT, it's across a number of agencies and across the federal government. And so incredibly impactful and powerful tool that we have. So just to get back to your question here, on the international side, I think there's always an opportunity, whether it's in the United States or other countries, to target the benefits of funding to disadvantaged communities. As you've heard, it's a very challenging effort that we're working across all levels of government to do in consultation with stakeholders and with the WEJAC, as you noted. So I can talk briefly, about what we did. But it's really been built on the shoulders, as has been said earlier, of the work of the communities that have been impacted most. And so, the most important thing is listening and asking what communities are being impacted, what can be done in the U.S., what can be done in other countries, how can we better target funding to ensure that the benefits are going to disadvantaged communities. I asked one of the leaders last night of the environmental justice movement, what examples she thought, and one of the examples that she said was really the commitment to put advisory councils in states so that there would be an opportunity to make the connection like we're doing here today, where environmental justice leaders have access to government officials, whether at the state level or the federal level, which has really led to the WEJAC, to provide an opportunity for sharing and listening. And so really it's more of what we're doing now, which is I'm learning today about how we can, more directly target benefits to communities, and building out in not only in the U.S. but in other country opportunities to really ask the question to the communities that are being most impacted, and to be able to figure out how you can embed those into government bureaucracy. So we're happy to help here in the U.S. If folks have interest, but there's a great opportunity. So thank you for asking that question.
Sure, Dr. Valsing, and you heard it, so please reach out to Dr. Valsing with questions. I think all the panelists here would be happy to engage on these topics. I want to turn it back to Dr. Wright and you, Jade, as well. We'll start with you, Jade. Again, kind of building off the last response and the question, how can WEJAC and the Justice 40 initiative be models for the promotion of equity, justice, and civic engagement for other governments and nations? And again, what's the opportunity that we have, and how can we get this right?
Yes, great question. So yeah, I do want to just acknowledge, what was just shared, that this council is historic, and it's an honor to be on this council. It's a big win And that said, we have a long way to go. It's a work in progress, it's developing. So regarding how this can be a model, the climate crisis can't be solved just through philanthropy or just through NGO investments and that sector alone. So I think this is a real myth that we need to keep disrupting across the climate environmental movements and in countries and nations across the globe. So I think, and yeah, I'm really curious actually why we really depend on those sectors alone to solve our problems. It's really curious to me. So I think with Justice 40, we really do have the potential to be a model where government takes full responsibility to invest in our communities. And the way we get it right is by really listening to us, listening to Dr. Wright and myself and our colleagues also on the WEJAC. And like I said before, with understanding the nuances of how we get the resources directly to our frontline communities, not just the tribal councils, and I'm speaking for Indigenous communities because that's where I come from. Those are my communities. We have to make sure that the processes and the relationships are strong to get those funds to the people as well. So making the resources really accessible is hugely important in making sure that Justice 40 is a success.
Thank you so much, Jade. Again, really wise and great words to share with the audience. I want to turn it to you, Dr. Wright, with a similar question, but with a little bit of a twist, because we are heading toward the end of the hour together. So the question I asked Jade was about the ways in which Justice 40 and WEJAC can be models for the rest of the world. But then I also want to ask you about the biggest challenge, right? Like, what is the biggest challenge that we face, and how can we get this right?
Well, I believe the biggest challenge is in implementation. And the fact that we are working within a system that is basically racist. So you have a systemic racism that has existed, and I can speak for African Americans in particular, and Jade can speak for Native Americans, but I think everyone knows about fight for civil rights and racism in this country. I want to give this very quick example. At one point in my life, I noticed that all the white people disappeared. The housing projects that used to be 50% black and 50% white, although separate, became 100% black. And I wondered where white people went. I later found out that there was a program by HUD to increase home ownership for the whole United States. It happened for white people, but it didn't happen for us. And so although the idea, the program was wonderful, it was put within a system that was basically racist. So what came out of that was something that was really racist, which helped further segregate the South, with people running from integration of schools, moving out to suburbs, and black people being left all along in the city. So the biggest challenge to me is not the idea. The idea is wonderful, and we've had ideas like Justice 40 for a long time. The challenge is in implementation and making certain that junk in, junk out is not what happens, but that we really see progress in equity in the distribution of benefits from the Justice 40 initiative.
I think that's a fantastic note to end on for today. We are right at the end of the hour, and as I can see, looking out into the audience, there's a lot of interest in this initiative. It is absolutely historic in nature, and as I say that, I'm getting chills. We have the opportunity to transform that system, right? And to really do good and make sure that we're tackling the climate crisis, that we're building economies, building local communities, and we're also addressing issues, long-standing issues of equity. So thank you so much for your time today. And we only have an hour. I'm sorry. We're going to get booted off the stage here. But thank you all for joining. We'll stick around for other questions if you have them. Thank you so much.